All right, let's dive into AWS Database Migration Service, DMS,
VMS.
specifically for all you senior engineers and software architects listening.
We're going to really break down some of these technical docs and figure out how this thing works.
Exactly, and we'll try to keep it jargon-free.
Yeah.
So, what is DMS?
Well, at its heart, DMS is a managed service that helps you move databases to AWS.
Okay.
And it's surprisingly versatile. You can move to the cloud from on-prem, between clouds, or even within AWS.
So not just getting data into AWS,
No.
you can also move it around within AWS.
You got it. And it's not limited to just one type of database either.
Okay.
We're talking relational databases, data warehouses, NoSQL, even some of those niche data stores you might come across.
Wow, that's a lot. So I imagine that flexibility is really appealing for complex enterprise environments.
For sure, think about a company that wants to modernize their infrastructure and they're trying to get off an expensive legacy database like Oracle. Maybe they want to move to something like Amazon Aurora, which is purpose-built for the cloud and potentially more cost-effective. DMS can handle that entire transition.
Interesting. So with all this data moving around, this must require some serious horsepower, right?
It does, yeah. DMS relies on EC2 instances called replication instances.
Okay.
And these are really the engines that power the migration.
So choosing the right replication instance is pretty important.
Oh, it's one of the most important decisions you'll make
Okay.
because underestimating your workload can lead to some performance bottlenecks.
Right.
And especially if you're using change data capture, which tracks ongoing data changes in real time, storage can be an issue too.
Change data capture. So that's a resource-intensive process.
It can be, yeah, which is why proper planning is essential. But luckily, AWS has a tool called DMS Fleet Advisor that can help.
Fleet Advisor, is that like having a migration consultant built into DMS?
Think of it as your guide. It analyzes your source database. It recommends the optimal migration target, whether that's Amazon Aurora, RDS, or Redshift.
Okay.
It even recommends the right instance size for those replication instances.
So that takes some of the guesswork out of it.
It does.
Before we get too deep, I think it might be helpful to just walk through the basic steps of a DMS migration.
Sure, the AWS documentation actually has a simple tutorial if you want to follow along.
Okay, perfect.
So the first step is to create an RDS database instance.
Okay,
That's going to be your target, where you're moving your data to.
got it.
Then you need to tell DMS where your data is coming from and where it's going, and that's by setting up source and target endpoints.
So endpoints, you're just kind of drawing the lines on the map for DMS to follow.
Exactly. Then you create a migration task. This is like the blueprint for the whole operation.
Okay.
And it defines things like the source and target endpoints, the replication instance you want to use, and any other special settings.
So the migration task is like the conductor, making sure everything happens in the right order.
I like that analogy.
Thanks.
And then finally, once the migration is complete, you want to validate everything.
Right.
Make sure that the data has been transferred correctly.
Quality control, very important.
It is.
So we've covered the basic tutorial, but I'm sure things can get a lot more complex.
Oh, yeah.
What are some of the more advanced features of DMS that maybe senior engineers and architects should know about?
Yeah, let's start with data collectors.
Oh.
So these are like scouts. They gather intel about your database environment before you even start migrating.
So recon before the big move.
Exactly.
Okay.
They collect metadata about your data and track resource utilization, things like CPU, memory, and storage usage.
So all the vital stats.
All the vital stats.
Understand.
And this is critical for right-sizing those replication instances to make
Yeah.
sure you have a smooth migration. All of that feeds into Fleet Advisor, remember?
Right, right.
And helps you make the best decisions.
I'm seeing how the different pieces fit together now.
It-
But setting up these data collectors, it sounds a bit involved. I was looking through the docs.
It can be, yeah. There are a few moving parts. You need an S3 bucket for storage and some IAM resources to manage permissions.
Those lovely AWS acronyms.
I know, but don't worry. CloudFormation can really simplify things.
Okay.
You can automate the setup of those data collectors, saves you a lot of time and headaches.
Phew.
Another interesting thing about data collectors is their use of LDP to discover servers on your network.
LDP.
Yeah.
You might be familiar with it.
Yeah, rings a bell.
It's a common directory protocol in a lot of enterprise environments,
Got it.
and it helps the data collectors find those servers.
Now, do data collectors just run once, or is it an ongoing thing?
You actually have options there.
Okay.
You can run them once for like a one-time assessment, or you can set them up for ongoing monitoring that'll constantly track changes in your environment.
All right, so I can choose between a quick recon mission or having eyes on the ground 24/7.
Right.
Pretty flexible. Okay, so data collectors, Check. What else?
Let's talk about schema conversion.
Okay.
Remember how we discussed switching database engines?
Yeah, trading in our old clunker for a shiny new sports car.
Right. Well, each database engine has its own unique way of structuring data. It's schema.
Right.
And when you switch engines, you often need to translate that schema to make it compatible with the new database.
So it's like the Rosetta Stone for databases?
It is.
Schema conversion.
And DMS schema conversion is the tool that makes that translation possible. It can convert tables, indexes, views, and even those stored procedure.
Stored procedures.
Yeah.
I saw something about generative AI being used for schema conversion, too.
Yeah, you're up on your stuff.
Trying to be.
DMS is now leveraging generative AI to streamline that conversion process, especially for complex migrations, like moving from Oracle or SQL Server to, say, PostgreSQL or Aurora PostgreSQL.
So the AI is helping to make these complex schema translations more accurate.
And more efficient. Yeah, it's like having a team of expert database engineers working behind the scenes to handle the heavy lifting.
That's reassuring.
Yeah.
So schema conversion, AI-powered, check. What else?
Let's talk about homogeneous migrations.
Okay.
So this is when you're moving data between the same database engine.
Okay.
For example, moving a MySQL database from on-prem to RDS MySQL in the cloud.
Same make and model, just a different parking spot.
Exactly. And what's cool about this is that DMS uses a serverless environment for this type of migration.
Serverless. Nice.
You don't have to manage any servers. DMS takes care of all the infrastructure for you.
That does simplify things.
It really does. And DMS even uses specific tools tailored to each database engine,
Okay.
like MySQL and MongoDB, to optimize that process.
So it's not just a generic approach.
It's tailored, yeah.
So even with homogeneous migrations, are there any gotchas we should be aware of?
Even with homogeneous migrations, there are things to look out for, like if you're dealing with very large tables, it's a good idea to break them down into smaller chunks for migration.
Divide and conquer.
Exactly.
Okay, so homogeneous migrations, check. What's next?
Let's talk about migration projects.
Okay.
So imagine you're not just migrating a single database, but an entire data center to the cloud.
Right.
That's where migration projects come in.
So it's project management for my migration.
Basically, it helps you organize and manage multiple database migrations, potentially across different VPCs.
PPCs, more acronyms.
I know, but they just provide a way to isolate your network environments
I'll go-
for security and compliance reasons.
So using different VPCs gives me more control over how the migrations are handled.
Exactly.
Anything else about migration projects?
Well, you can manage them using infrastructure as code with AWS CloudFormation.
CloudFormation, okay.
This is a huge win for automation and repeatability.
Right.
You can define your entire migration project as code, makes it much easier to manage and scale.
Infrastructure as code, always a good thing.
Always a good thing.
So migration projects, check. What's next?
Let's go back to those replication instances.
Okay, yeah.
Remember, these are the EC2 instances that are doing the actual data transfer.
Right, the workhorses.
The workhorses, yeah. And one important feature to be aware of is multi-AZ deployment.
Okay.
This means you can have a standby replica of your replication instance running in a different AWS availability zone.
So if one availability zone goes down, the migration can keep going.
Exactly. It's all about high availability
Right.
and minimizing downtime.
Love redundancy.
Yeah. You can also use a custom on-premises name server for DNS resolution if you need tighter control over your network configurations.
So instead of relying on AWS's DNS, I
Mhm.
can use my own internal DNS server.
Got it.
Okay, so more control, more customization.
And that can be helpful if you have specific security or compliance requirements.
Right, makes sense. So replication instances, check. What else?
Let's talk about serverless replication. This is a new, streamlined way to run your migrations without having to manage those replication instances at all.
Serverless, even better.
It is DMS basically analyzes your workload,
Okay.
and it automatically provisions the necessary compute and storage capacity for you.
So it's like DMS is self-aware now.
You could say that really simplifies things.
Right.
And another thing is serverless replication uses CloudWatch for logging.
Okay.
So you get much better visibility into the status and the progress of your migrations.
So if something goes wrong, it's easier to troubleshoot.
Exactly.
Okay, so serverless replication, check. What's next?
Let's talk about some of those more advanced features, give you even more control over your migrations.
All right.
So first up, bidirectional replication.
Bidirectional.
This allows you to keep two databases in sync with each other.
Okay.
So data is flowing in both directions.
So they're like live mirrors of each other.
You can think about it that way.
When would I use something like that?
Tons of scenarios.
Oh.
Think about disaster recovery. You need a backup database that's constantly up to date.
Right.
Or maybe you need to keep data consistent between your development and production environments. Bidirectional replication can handle that.
Okay, bidirectional replication, check. What else?
Another one is change data capture, or CDC.
CDC, we touched on that earlier.
We did, and this is what allows you to perform migrations with minimal downtime.
Right.
Instead of copying the entire database, CDC only replicates the changes,
Okay.
which makes the whole process faster and more efficient.
Like sending incremental updates instead of shipping the whole package every time.
Exactly, and it's especially powerful for databases that are constantly being updated.
Okay, CDC, check. What else?
Time travel.
Time travel.
It's as cool as it sounds.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Imagine you need to recover data from a specific point in time. Maybe you accidentally deleted some critical data or made a change you need to revert.
Okay.
With time travel, you can essentially rewind the clock on your database and restore it to a previous state.
Wow, that's really powerful, like a safety net.
Is.
Time travel, check. Can't talk about migrations without talking about troubleshooting.
For sure. Thankfully, the DMS documentation has a really comprehensive troubleshooting section.
Okay.
Covers a wide range of common issues, and they even have specific guidance for different database engines, which can be super helpful.
So if I'm having a problem with, say, my Oracle migration,
Yeah,
there's Oracle-specific troubleshooting tips.
they got you covered.
That's helpful. Okay. Troubleshooting, check. Last but not least, security.
Of course.
How does DMS protect my sensitive data?
So security is paramount, especially when we're moving sensitive data around.
Right.
DMS uses SSL for secure data transfer.
Okay.
That's the same encryption used for websites.
So my data is encrypted in transit.
It is, and you can also configure DMS to encrypt your data at rest using encryption keys.
Okay.
That means that even if someone gained unauthorized access to the storage, they wouldn't be able to read the data without the key.
Data is protected both in motion and at rest.
Exactly. DMS also integrates with AWS's IAM, that's Identity and Access Management.
Right, I am.
Yeah, this lets you control who has access to your DMS resources and what they can do with them.
So IAM is like the bouncer for my AWS account,
I like that.
making sure that only authorized users can get in.
Exactly.
And you can even use resource tagging to further refine your access control.
You
Gives you even more granular control over your security.
You got it.
Okay, so DMS is a pretty robust security posture.
It does.
I'm impressed.
Good.
So we've covered a lot of ground here,
We have.
from the basics of setting up a migration to some of the more advanced features.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that senior engineers and software architects should keep in mind before jumping into DMS?
One thing that's often overlooked is the power of table mapping
Okay.
and transformation rules.
Table mapping.
These allow you to manipulate your data on the fly
Okay.
as it's being migrated.
So I can do more than just move data. I
Yeah.
can actually transform it.
You can?
Okay. How so?
You can rename columns, you can change data types, even filter out data you don't need.
Okay.
This gives you incredible control over the final shape of your data in that target database.
So I could do things like clean up inconsistencies in my data,
You could.
or maybe combine data from multiple tables into a single table in the target database.
Exactly. It's all about flexibility.
Wow. Table mapping sounds pretty powerful.
It is.
I think we need to dedicate some time to really digging into that.
We should, yeah. It's a deep dive in itself.
Okay, we'll save that for next time. I'm already feeling a little overwhelmed, but in a good way.
It's a lot to take in.
It is.
But hopefully this is giving you a good foundation.
It has, absolutely.
Yeah.
Welcome back. Last time we kind of set the stage for understanding DMS.
We did.
You know, what it is, the key components of those features.
Right.
But now let's dive a little deeper into how DMS handles all these different database engines,
Yeah, good idea.
because it supports a ton. You know, Oracle, SQL Server, PostgreSQL, MongoDB, all sorts.
It's a whole zoo of databases.
It is. So I imagine each engine has its own, quirks and things to watch out for.
Oh, absolutely. And DMS has specific settings and configurations to handle all those nuances. Really make that migration process as smooth as possible.
So let's start with one of the big ones, Oracle.
Okay. Oracle.
What makes migrating those databases unique?
Well, Oracle is known for its, robustness and
Right.
sometimes its complexity.
Good.
So migrating from an Oracle environment requires a bit of finesse.
Okay.
First and foremost, you need to make sure you have the right permissions set up on your source database.
Okay. Permissions, always fun.
Always a joy, but it's crucial for security, right?
Oh,
making sure that DMS can actually access the data it needs
To do its job.
to do its job. Exactly. Another key consideration with Oracle is how you're going to capture those ongoing data changes.
Right.
For those minimal downtime migrations, DMS gives you two options there.
Okay.
Oracle Log Miner and AWS DMS Binary Reader.
Two options. What's the difference?
Well, Log Miner is the more traditional approach.
Right.
It analyzes Oracle's redo logs, which is essentially a record of all the changes made to the database.
Okay.
It's been around for a while, it's reliable, but it can be a bit resource intensive, especially for large databases.
So what's the other option?
AWS DMS Binary Reader.
Binary reader.
Yeah, this is a newer option that offers much better performance
Okay.
and scalability. Instead of parsing those redo logs, it reads them directly in a binary format.
So it's more efficient.
Much more efficient.
Fair.
It bypasses a lot of the overhead. So binary reader is generally the preferred method these days,
Okay.
especially if you're dealing with, large-scale migrations
Right.
or high-volume data changes.
Now, I noticed in the docs something about supplemental logging for Oracle.
Yes.
What is that?
So supplemental logging, this is crucial if you're using change data capture,
Okay.
because by default, Oracle's redo logs don't contain all the information that DMS needs
Okay.
to accurately replicate changes.
So it's like a map with some missing pieces.
It is. Supplemental logging fills in those gaps,
Okay.
gives DMS the complete picture of each data change.
So what kind of information does it capture?
It can capture things like primary keys, foreign keys, unique constraints,
Okay.
even all the columns in a table if you need that level of detail.
Wow. So it sounds like you can really fine-tune those settings
You can.
based on what you need.
Exactly. It's all about finding that balance, right?
Right.
Capturing enough information for accurate change data capture,
Right.
but also minimizing that overhead on your source database.
Makes sense. So we talked about capturing changes. What about moving those big chunks of data, those LOBs, large objects?
LOBs, yeah, they can definitely pose a challenge,
Yeah.
especially when you're dealing with multimedia files or other large data types.
Right.
But luckily, DMS has a few ways to handle them during an Oracle migration.
Okay. So what are my options?
You can use full LOB mode,
Full OB mode.
which basically migrates the entire LOB regardless of its size. Ensures you don't lose any data, but it can slow down the migration, especially for those very large LOBs.
So if I'm really worried about losing data, I go with full LOB mode.
Exactly, but if you can afford to truncate those really large LOBs to speed things up, you can use limited LOB mode,
Okay.
which sets a size threshold, and anything above that gets truncated.
Got it. Any other Oracle-specific things we should know about?
One cool feature is that DMS supports migrating Oracle spatial data types.
Spatial data types, what is that?
So this is for data that represents, geographic locations or geometric shapes.
So if I'm working with maps, GPS coordinates, that kind of thing.
Exactly. DMS can handle those specialized data types
Very good.
and convert them to a format that's compatible with your target database.
Okay, so we've covered Oracle. What about SQL Server?
All right, SQL Server.
Another popular one. Any key things to keep in mind when migrating from that platform?
Much like Oracle, permissions are crucial.
Okay.
Got to make sure DMS has the right access to your SQL Server source database.
Okay.
But what makes SQL Server migrations a bit easier is that it actually has a built-in change data capture mechanism
Okay.
called Microsoft CDC.
Microsoft CDC.
Yeah, and this makes setting up change data capture for those migrations a breeze.
So it's like SQL Server comes with its own supplemental logging.
You could say that you don't have to worry about configuring any separate logging options like you do with Oracle.
Much easier.
Much easier. Another thing worth mentioning is that AWS has made some significant improvements to DMS to handle SQL Server databases that are part of an always-on availability group.
Always on. That's for high availability, right?
Exactly. It lets you create a cluster of SQL Server instances for redundancy.
Okay.
And DMS is now smart enough to handle these complex cluster configurations.
So it can handle even the most demanding environments.
It can.
Very impressive. All right, so we've got Oracle SQL Server. What about PostgreSQL?
Okay, Postgres.
The open source database. What makes migrating from PostgreSQL unique?
So PostgreSQL has its own approach to change data capture using a feature called logical replication.
Logical replication.
This allows changes from the source database to be streamed to a replica in a more human-readable format.
Human readable, meaning I can actually understand what those changes are.
Exactly. It's not just a bunch of binary data. It's a logical representation of what's happening.
Okay.
And DMS can tap into that logical replication stream to capture changes for your migrations.
Very cool. Any gotchas with PostgreSQL I should be aware of?
One thing that sometimes trips people up is handling unbounded numeric values.
Unbounded numeric values, what are those?
So these are essentially numbers with very high precision,
Yeah.
and they can sometimes cause issues with data truncation during a migration.
Those pesky decimals that go on forever.
Exactly. Luckily, DMS has a setting that lets you map those unbounded numeric values as strings,
Okay.
which prevents any data loss.
Good to know. So we've got Oracle, SQL Server, PostgreSQL. Does DMS support any other databases?
It does. We've covered the big three, but DMS can handle a wide range of other databases. From MySQL and MongoDB to even some more niche platforms like IBM DB2, SAP, ASE.
Wow, it really does cover a lot.
It does.
I imagine each of those has their own considerations and settings within DMS.
They do. Each database is unique,
Right.
and DMS has been designed to accommodate those differences.
So it really is like a one-stop shop for all my database migration needs.
It is.
Okay, but let's face it, configuring DMS for all these different databases, it could be a bit daunting.
Yeah, it can be a bit overwhelming at first.
There's so many options and settings.
There are, but thankfully the AWS documentation is super thorough.
Okay, that's good.
They have detailed guides for each supported database platform,
Good.
and they walk you through all the specific settings and configurations you need to make.
So it's like having a separate instruction manual for each database.
Exactly. Makes it much easier to navigate the complexities of DMS and make sure you have a successful migration.
But there's one more feature we need to talk about, and that's table mapping.
Yes, table map.
That's where we just tell DMS which tables to migrate, right?
Well, it's more than just selecting tables.
Uh,
Table mapping is where you can really get creative and fine-tune your migrations.
okay, tell me more.
Remember those transformation rules we talked about?
Yeah?
Well, this is where you put those rules into action.
Okay.
You can rename columns, change data types, even filter out rows based on specific criteria.
So I could, like, clean up inconsistencies in my data?
You could.
Or maybe combine data from multiple tables into a single table in the target?
Exactly.
That's pretty awesome.
It is.
Sounds really powerful.
It is. And DMS makes it pretty easy to define those mapping rules, even for complex scenarios.
Okay, we're definitely going to need to do a deep dive on that.
We will.
But for now, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about validation.
Okay, validation.
That's how we make sure that everything landed in the target correctly, right?
It is. We've talked about moving mountains of data, transforming it on the fly, but it's crucial to make sure that everything's where it's supposed to be and in the right format.
So what kind of tools does DMS give us for validation?
So DMS has a built-in data validation feature,
Okay.
compares the source and target data to make sure they match.
Oh.
You can choose between full validation,
Okay.
which compares every single row and column,
Right.
or you can do row count validation, which just verifies that the number of rows is the same in both databases.
So full validation is the more thorough approach.
It is.
Row count is just a quick check.
Exactly. You can choose the level that makes sense for your needs.
Makes sense. I also noticed something in the documentation about S3.
It's free validation, yeah.
What is that?
This is a neat trick that uses S3, Amazon's cloud storage service,
Okay.
as an intermediary.
Okay.
So instead of comparing data directly between the source and target, DMS can unload the source data to S3
Okay.
and then compare it against data loaded from the target.
So we're using S3 as a common ground for comparison.
Exactly, and it's especially useful for those really large data sets.
Right.
Because S3 is designed to handle massive amounts of data very efficiently.
Right. Makes sense. Any other advantages of using S3 validation?
It can also be helpful when you're migrating between different database platforms
Okay.
where direct comparisons might not be feasible.
Right.
S3 acts as that universal translator,
Got it.
lets DMS validate even those migrations between, very different systems.
Very clever. Okay. So S3 validation, check. We've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
From database-specific considerations to data validation, I'm feeling much more confident about tackling some of these migrations.
I'm glad to hear that we're almost there. In our next session, we'll tie everything together
Okay.
and leave you with some actionable takeaways
Sounds good.
and best practices for your migration journeys.
All right, welcome back to the final part of our DMS deep dive.
The grand finale.
We've gone through a ton of features,
Yeah.
explored how DMS handles different database engines.
A lot of information.
What's that last bit of info that senior engineers and architects need for their, migration toolbox?
Let's talk about how DMS fits into that broader AWS ecosystem.
Okay, yeah, it's not an island. It integrates with other AWS services,
It does.
which can really supercharge those migrations.
For sure, for sure.
So which integrations are particularly useful for, DMS migrations?
One of the most powerful is the integration with AWS CloudFormation.
CloudFormation, oh yeah, infrastructure as code.
Infrastructure as code. You can use CloudFormation to define your entire DMS infrastructure.
Okay.
Your replication instances, endpoints, migration tasks, everything as code.
So no more clicking around in the console.
No more clicking around.
That's a huge win for automation
for sure.
and repeatability.
You can version control your infrastructure, easily spin up new environments, ensure consistency across all your migrations.
Infrastructure as code for the win. What other integrations are good?
Another important one is the integration with AWS KMS, Key Management Service. This allows you to manage your encryption keys for DMS in a secure, centralized way.
So instead of managing all those keys manually,
Yeah, no more juggling twos.
I can just use KMS to create them, store them, rotate them.
Exactly. It just adds that extra layer of security
Yeah.
and simplifies key management.
Okay, CloudFormation, KMS. What about integrations with storage services? I know we talked about S3 for validation, but are there any other ways DMS and S3 work together?
So if you're using S3 as a target for your migrations,
Yeah.
DMS can automatically apply S3's object tagging
Go.
and lifecycle policies to your migrated data.
So I can easily categorize and manage the data once it's in S3,
Exactly.
even automate things like retention and archiving.
For sure.
Very cool.
It's all about making your life easier.
Great.
Make sure that data is organized and protected.
DMS, the team player. So final piece of advice. What do our listeners really need to know?
I can't emphasize this enough. Plan, plan, plan.
The 3 Ps.
The 3 Ps of migration success.
Like that.
Don't underestimate the importance of planning before you start any migration, big or small.
So what does effective planning look like, in the context of a DMS migration?
It starts with understanding your source database environment.
Okay.
You need to know its size, complexity, any quirks, any limitations.
Know thy data.
Exactly. Then you need to choose the right migration strategy.
Okay.
Do you go for a full load, a CDC approach, or a hybrid? The best strategy really depends.
Right, there's no one size fits all.
No one size fits all.
Okay.
It depends on things like your downtime tolerance, the size of your database, the specific requirements of your application.
And don't forget about those table mappings and transformation rules.
Ah, yes, good point. Carefully planning these can save you so many headaches down the road.
Right.
Make sure your data lands in the target exactly how you need it.
So we're almost like data architects, designing how the data is going to live in its new home.
Exactly. And of course, no matter how well you plan, sometimes things go wrong. That's why testing is crucial.
Always.
Always test. Test your migration in a non-production environment first. Make sure your data is flowing correctly, transformations are working, and everything's performing as you expect.
So plan carefully, test thoroughly.
Yeah.
Don't be afraid to ask for help.
AWS has a ton of resources to support you.
Ah,
Detailed documentation, blog posts, support engineers.
they got you covered.
They got you covered.